So we're going to talk about disassembling, cleaning, and restoring enigmas. Dan and I have been doing this for a very long time. We've really a great many enigmas, many dozens of enigmas have crossed our tables over the years. And we've had a good time doing this and a lot of fun. And it gives us a chance to really delve the inside of an enigma, see what's going on inside the thing. So I'm going to start in and just mention, as Bob did, our book. And the book is available from us directly. If you just want to email enigmamuseum.com, give us your address. We'll give you a quote for the book. A book costs $20 and whatever postage is necessary in order to get it to you. RSGB also sells them pretty efficiently. ARRL has always been a little flaky in terms of their sales, so it's a little more easier if you go through us. I'm going to start in just showing you the inside of an Enigma. And one of the wonderful things about Enigmas is that they're modular, and that makes it so much easier to work on them, so much easier to service them. And one of the intriguing things about the Enigma, I think, is the fact that there are only 80 wires inside of the entire Enigma. There are 3 groups of 26 wires, as you would expect for the 26 letters in the alphabet, and 2 more wires which are active in getting the battery voltage into the wiring. So it's really a pretty simple device in terms of wiring. And you can boil it down even further and just look at any one of those 26 sets of wires and find that it is really very simple. And we'll do that a little later on. The Enigma wiring harness looks like this. And indeed, again, we're looking at 3 sets of 26 wires here. Even though it may look a little bit daunting. On the left, we have the input wheel, which has 26 wires going into the rotor stack. On the right, we have the plug board, which has actually 2 wires going to the 2 connections on the plug board. We have the keyboard switches with 3 wires going to each keyboard switch, and we have the light bulb panel with 26 wires going to it. So not a rocket science type of device, and happily quite easy to service. This is another way of looking at the diagram. Again, the wiring maybe looks a little bit complex, but again, you can boil it down to just 26 sets of 3 wires, plus a little bit of wiring over in the top left here, which is the battery voltage coming in. I'll just put a cursor on the screen here. So in addition to those 80 wires, there are, of course, the wires in each of the rotors. And each rotor has 26 wires inside it. And Dan's going to actually be restoring and repairing a rotor, so you'll have a chance to look inside the rotor. And the reflector at the bottom here has 13 wires. So if you add up all of those, you get 91 wires in the rotors and reflector, and you get 80 wires in the Enigma, which means that the entire machine with all of its wiring is only 171 total wires. As Klaus Schmey always starts out his talks with little Lego workers doing the decoding for him, I thought that we would show some of our little Lego workers who do the disassembly for us. But in America, we have something much more impressive, and that is Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle can really rip apart an Enigma in real tremendous speed. And we also have a secret weapon, and that is 2 kids. And these kids, of course, are expert repairers of Enigma and help us a great deal over the years. When you're working on an Enigma, you have to have the proper tools, of course, and you have to be very careful not to damage the Enigma. So the selection of your tools is very important. As you see here, we have a special set of Enigma repair tools. And with that silliness, I'll go on to show you a time-lapse video of the disassembly and cleaning of an Enigma machine. And what I'm going to do is just run through this very quickly, and it's going to give you a very quick overview of what I'm going to cover in somewhat more detail afterwards. So this will be the first run through, and then I'll go through the same pictures again, but I will slow down, talk about individual steps in disassembling an Enigma. And at that point, I encourage you to ask questions. Push the space bar on your keyboard and ask us any questions that you might have regarding things that I am covering. So right now, let me go to the time-lapse video. And I decided that it was appropriate, since it's sort of a spotty thing, to use some old silent movie music to go along with it. So here we go, the beginning and end of the disassembly, slight repair, and then reassembly of an Enigma. Okay, so now we have disassembled and reassembled an Enigma, and we'll go back and do it a little more slowly. And again, please chime in if you have any questions as we go. We'll start out with the box, and it's pretty obvious how to open the box. There's a latch on the front, but in actuality, that latch sometimes binds up, and you have to slide or push the top of the box a little bit to the left or right to get it to open. You'll open the little door on the front of the latch, and then hopefully the machine will open easily. Unfortunately, people that don't know that have in the past tried prying the box open and done a tremendous amount of damage. So now we have the box open, and we open the board in front of the plug board. We open the top of the Enigma, and the top of the Enigma is opened by unscrewing two screws that you see on the left and the right side here, on the right and left. And those screws sometimes are bound up, sometimes they're bent, but generally it comes apart okay. And then if you look carefully on the right, you'll see the battery box being opened. Battery boxes are often corroded, and you have to work on the corrosion in there. Sometimes they're corroded and stuck. If you watch over here on the left, you'll see the rotor release lever moving forward, and there it goes, moving forward, and that frees up the rotors and allows them to be removed along with the rotor shaft from the Enigma machine. We then take the rotors off the rotor shaft and lay them aside, move them away from the Enigma, and then we have to remove the box from the Enigma. And in order to do that, you have to get at the screws on the bottom of the Enigma. You have to close the top of the Enigma and lay it on something so that you can unscrew the screws on the bottom. There's actually 4 screws usually. This one happened to have 3. You can remove the box then and lay it aside. And you'll notice this is a very interesting Enigma, one of the very few that we've ever found that has a hole actually cast into the center of the base. And we still do not know to this day why this enigma has that hole in the bottom, but it's very clear. So then you turn the enigma over, bang against the box a little bit to make yourself some room. Forgot to do that when I was doing this, and start looking at the enigma itself. The easiest thing to do with an enigma is to take off the stecker board first, and before that to take off the metal back sort of side shielding on the side and back of the enigma. The one thing I should point out here is that the screws on an enigma have very, very narrow notches, and you have to use a screwdriver that is the proper width in order to fit into those notches in order not to do damage to the machine. So then we move that back off, and the top of the enigma, the top of the cover of the enigma, is connected to the back by more than screws. So it actually has to come off with it. We lay it aside over here. Does anybody have any questions? Just go ahead and ask as I'm talking here. The next step is to unscrew the stecker board from the front of the enigma. There are typically 8 screws, and the stecker board then opens sort of like a door, and the hinge is the wiring. The wiring between the stecker board and the rest of the enigma is all bundled very nicely, and in our experience, we've never had any problems with the wiring of an enigma, and we have had a chance to talk to a number of enigma repairmen who actually worked on enigmas in the field during the war. We have a sign on our table at Friedrichshafen asking them to come and talk to us and tell us stories. We asked them, what kind of problems do you typically have with the enigma? Is the wiring a problem? And they have universally said, no, wiring is essentially bomb-proof. Interesting choice of words. The only real problem we have typically is with the contacts of the rotors, which are, of course, brass-on-brass contacts. However, we found that the stecker board is a source of wiring problems, and that the switches under the keys are also a source of problems. We remove the cover from the back of the stecker board, and this reveals the contacts for the stecker board and the shorting bars that you see connecting the contacts together. And we'll talk about those in a little while. Very simple to remove the light bulb panel. There are only 4 screws, 2 on the left and 2 on the right, and then you can move the light bulb panel aside. And now you have a very nice layout in which you have the ability to service and check the wiring on the light bulb panel on the left, on the stecker board panel on the right, and the next step is to remove the keyboard keys. And in order to do that, you have to get at the bottom of the machine and unscrew the 4 screws that hold the keyboard keys in place. And then you can remove the keyboard keys and pull them away from the machine. And you can actually see how they work mechanically. And at the same time, you can see the keyboard switches that lie under these keys. And those are a source of that typically need repairing and need cleaning, because again, the Germans did not use gold or silver or platinum contacts, and therefore the contacts are a little more susceptible to problems than they would be otherwise. So a quick look at those switches. Each keyboard key is associated with one three plate double throw single pole double throw switches. And when you push down on a key, it closes the normally open contact and it opens the normally closed contact. And those need to be cleaned. On the stecker board, we see that the major problem is these little shorting bars that connect the 2 sockets together. And again, there's no, they aren't even using similar metals. They're dissimilar metals, steel on the contact and brass on the shorting bar. So they are quite prone to causing problems. The light bulb panel is pretty bomb-proof. You can see that each of the connections to the bottom of the light bulb is spring-loaded, and they are pretty good. You can clean them, and that's usually all that's needed there. So the next thing we do, look at the keyboard itself on the front, make sure that all of the keys move freely, maybe add a little bit of lubrication if necessary, but we try to stay away from lubricating anything because of the possibility that the lubricant might get into the contacts. And the next step is to clean each of the contacts. And I prefer a spatula with tiny little specks of diamond on it, a diamond spatula, and it fits really nicely in between the contacts. And Dan uses sandpaper and sort of fold it over twice and find that that works very well too. And here's the spatula again. We have to clean the contact between the shorting bars on each of these pairs of contacts and the socket. And it requires pretty good cleaning in order to eliminate problems in the stecker board. Any questions while we have the machine apart like this? Anybody have any questions about any part so far?
Was removing the rotors important to disassembling, or was that just done as a precaution?
Thank you, Bob. It was absolutely unnecessary. It has nothing to do with this process whatsoever. So they could have been left in, but it always seemed a little more prudent to get them out of the way in case we slipped or made some kind of a mistake and we wouldn't take the rotors with us. Any other questions?
Yeah, Tom, this is Ralph. Were you going to mention anything about the mechanism that advances the rotors? Because that's on my Enigma, that was one area that was sticking and it wouldn't advance the rotors. And it was quite tricky to get into there to clean them up, I found.
Thank you, Ralph. Dan is going to mention that, and it is a very major problem. Virtually every Enigma has problems in that area. I'll just point out what we're talking about back here. There are really two things back there, and Dan's going to talk about both of them. There are little rubber rollers which index the rotors and keep them from moving slightly in a way that might break the contact. And the biggest problem is the mechanism that is involved in stepping the rotors, the so-called pawls, as they're called, P-A-W-L. And they, in every Enigma practically that we've ever seen, many, many, many dozens of Enigmas, I have seen very few Enigmas where all three pawls were free. And unfortunately, the bearing is very hard to get at. And Dan will talk about the various techniques that we've had to use in order to free them up, because taking apart that assembly is prohibitive because of a number of pins that are driven in. Again, Dan will talk about that. Any other questions before we button it up and move on?
Yes, Tom, maybe you could give us a sense of how much time you spend on each of these steps as you go through them.
Dan will do that. It depends totally, Bill, on what the machine needs. If the machine is particularly dirty, we test it sort of as we go along, and if we find that we haven't adequately cleaned the keyboard contacts or the stecker board contacts, we have to go back and do it again. So I would say that the range is we might spend as little as half an hour cleaning these contacts, or we might end up spending as much as 3 or 4 hours on them, again, depending on what we encounter and how much corrosion and whether any repairs are actually necessary. Any other questions?
Do you have ever have any issues with corrosion of springs or anything underneath the keys? I mean, my keyboard, I noticed the springs are a really good condition, but do you ever have any Enigmas where those need to be replaced?
Well, the springs I think that you're talking about, Patrick, are the horizontal contacts themselves, and they are pretty bomb-proof unless the machine has been badly damaged. The springiness of each of these little flat bars is very important for the operation of the contacts. And we have had a couple of times where they were bent, one or two of them were bent. We found that we could bend them back up. Is that what you're referring to, or are you talking about the springs on the keys themselves?
The key shafts one, but yeah, yeah.
Okay, the contacts, is that right?
The key shafts.
Oh, the keys. Okay. Well, the keys also require a rather dramatic technique of cleaning. We have to make absolutely sure that the keys pass through this plate freely and pass through the plate on top, the top of the keyboard freely. And you can do that usually if it binds at all, you can use some ultrafine 2000 grit sandpaper to free them up, and if necessary, a very slight amount of lubricant. But again, Dan could address those questions maybe more efficiently. Anybody else have questions before we continue?
Yes, Detlef here from Germany. I do have a machine which was really inappropriately serviced. Well, not really serviced. So the chap used very rough sandpaper. Have you had similar things, and do you rework the contacts then? What would you suggest to do then in such a case when the contacts are really very rough by a completely inappropriate sandpaper?
You have to just do your best. It's very difficult to service the individual contacts. What we find is that occasionally we are able to get good contacts out of relic enigmas and replace very badly damaged contacts. If someone has just filed the thing down hopelessly, we can sometimes replace one of the flat contacts with something that we've gotten from a relic. Is that any help to you?
Well, I'm not in the position to have a salvage Enigma around. So I have a couple of units, but I'm lacking the spare parts.
If you send us a picture of the problem, maybe we can make some suggestions to you that might be helpful to you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, we'll close it up then, and it's very simple to reassemble. The same process. You put the keyboard key mechanism on top, close up the light bulb panel, bring the stecker board around, and put.
Tom, could I interrupt you? I'm sorry. I just saw that Richard had a question about the keyboard. So before you closed it up, I thought maybe you could answer. He chatted it in there.
Yeah, go ahead.
Is he still with us? I'll read it to you. He said if you have removed a bakelite letter from its stem on the keyboard, how do you remove the thin C-channel cylinder that fastens it to the post stem?
Okay, Dan's going to cover that. He has done a lot of key replacements and key repairs, and he will talk about how to repair the tops of the keys. Were there any other? I didn't see that. Thank you, Kathleen.
Sorry, I did have trouble unmuting myself there. I had one question about the Paul assembly in the back. Is the sticking that happens there, are they zinc on zinc contacts and it's corroding through?
Dan is going to actually show you pictures of that and we'll address that problem. Any other questions just about the general disassembly? Okay, I'm just going to button it up then and go back and talk a little bit about the wiring. Again, we're talking about very simple wiring in the machine, and I just want to review how the machine works using Ralph's absolutely wonderful schematic diagrams of the machine. I'm going to start out with a picture of the wiring that is used in order to encode the letter A as the illumination of the light bulb H. And we'll start out and trace the path of electricity through the machine and see how pressing the A key illuminates the letter H key. We start out by pressing the A key. Thank you, Ralph, for this wonderful drawing and activated drawing. And we then see that the voltage from the battery, the upper battery, actually we're showing two batteries here, but they really are the same battery. The battery voltage comes out through the normally open contact of the A key, which is now closed, and goes into the upper one of the two sockets on the plug board on the front of the Enigma. If there is no jumper in that plug board socket, then the A key upper socket is connected over to the lower socket by one of those shorting bars that we saw. But here we're showing what happens if we have a jumper wire in the plug board that connects the A to the letter O key. And we see that that jumper wire literally connects from the upper input socket on the A key, on the A socket on the stecker board over to the lower socket on the O key on the stecker board. The wiring inside these cables, jumper cables, is reversed. And that's why the upper contact is connected to the lower contact. Then we trace the voltage as it enters the entry drum, and the entry drum starts it on its journey through the three rotors. And although the entry drum has the contact continue on through and leave the entry drum as an O, it then enters each of the rotors in sequence and gets connected over to a different letter. So it goes through the first rotor, the second rotor, the third rotor to the left, and then finally it exits the rotor stack and enters the reflector. The reflector has 13 wires in it that connect the incoming wire to an outgoing terminal, and the outgoing terminal then sends the electrical voltage back through the rotor stack and back to the entry drum, where it leaves the entry drum as the letter M. And in this case, the letter M has had a jumper wire installed that connects it over to the letter H on the stecker board. And again, this is the plug board or stecker board. And then the voltage comes out through the H key, under the H key, and goes through the normally closed contacts. Since the H is not being depressed, those contacts are closed, and that completes the circuit and allows the light bulb to illuminate. So it's basically just the circuit of a simple flashlight. But by looking at this diagram, you can see how it is impossible for pressing the A key to illuminate the A light. And that is one of the Achilles heels of the Enigma. When you press a letter and encode that letter, it can never be encoded as itself. And this diagram that Ralph has drawn beautifully demonstrates that. But to make the point even more clearly, I'd like to go the opposite direction and see what happens when you push the H key and it illuminates the A light bulb. And we'll do that a little quicker. We'll press the H key. We see that the voltage then is connected from the battery through the H key to the H connection on the stecker board, which is jumpered over to the M, which then leads into the entry drum, goes through the rotors to the reflector on the left, back through the rotors, through the entry drum, and exit as an O, comes out to the stecker board as an O, gets jumpered over to an A, and the voltage then comes out into the normally closed contacts of the A light bulb, and the A is illuminated. And again, you can see how it's impossible for the H key to illuminate the H light bulb because it's just disconnected itself from that light bulb. And I think it's a really nice way to show this. And again, I can't thank Ralph enough for this great diagram. The diagram also allows us to show problems that we've had in these connections. The keyboard keys are very subject to problems through corrosion, so I put a little yellow circle around them. Every one of the connections on the plug board is very subject to difficulties and problems, and they need to be cleaned. The rotors themselves, the entry rotor, the rotors themselves, and the reflector are pretty much self-sufficient unless they happen to have problems with the springs on the rotors not pushing out, or the little pins are bound as they come out. And you can check that very easily just by looking at the rotors and feeling them. So these are the things that we have to focus on. And again, I'd like to point out that this is another reason why Enigmas are much more reliable when they're used fairly often than when they're allowed to sit, because when you use them, these contacts actually very microscopically burnish each other. They slide sideways as this comes up, very microscopically, and that helps to clean them. Unfortunately, it doesn't happen in the plug board contacts, and you have to get in there and clean them. Sometimes just going in and pushing a stecker or plug in and out a number of times helps to deal with that problem. Dan is going to talk about the wiring inside the rotors. Dan is going to show the wiring inside the rotors. So let me move on and talk about the question of whether one is going to restore an Enigma or not. On the left, we have an Enigma that is what we would call a relic, as found, as dug, in this case, as removed from a lake. And on the right, we have sort of an Enigma that's been found in a basement. It's sort of a mess. And the question is, are you going to restore the Enigma or not? And we have goals when we restore Enigmas. When we restore Enigmas, we try to return the Enigma to nearly its original appearance. We do not ever try to remove the scars of war or the things that have happened to the cabinet, but we do try to ensure that the machine is in as perfect working condition as we can. That's not always easy because, again, brass on brass contacts are not anywhere as near reliable as gold or silver or platinum. Bletchley Park asked us for an Enigma machine that they would use in their so-called Enigma Mobile, which is a machine that goes to various schools and shows kids how Enigmas work. And we had to work very hard on that machine in order to try and make it as bomb-proof as possible. We cleaned it, we re-cleaned it, cleaned it again, and cleaned it again, and everything short of gold plating the contacts. And it worked pretty well. We got pretty good reports from them that they had a successful time over the years with that machine. The alternative is to stabilize a machine as a historic war relic. And the decision of whether to restore it to working condition or stabilize it is driven by typically how important the machine is. So we have the war relic on the left, and we generally, if it has history, important history that we can point out, we prefer to leave it as a historic war relic. And on the right, we have a machine and we restore it back to as good condition as we can. Let me talk about the Enigma found in U-85. These were reported on David Hamer's website. He got to know the divers who went diving on this machine, and the removal of this machine produced a machine that looks about like some of those Baltic Sea machines. It's in rough condition, especially since it's been in salt water for so many years, 65 years or so. And the question here is, do you restore a machine like this, or do you just clean it? What are you going to do? And the decision, first of all, was to clean the machine and just clean off the mud. You can see that the machine is quite interesting. It has a power plug here, and it has a plate over the light bulbs, which turns out to be where the electrical voltage for a printer is picked up. A very interesting machine, and it was decided that the machine would be restored. And Jim Aram spent years, literally years, boiling the salt out of the metal in this machine and coming to as complete a restoration as he could manage. And it's a really beautiful job. It's on display in a museum in, I think, North or South Carolina, and really extraordinary. But you can see that he did not fully restore it to working condition because the rotors were really in very bad condition. But it looks great, and it serves as a good memento of the war. As we all know, Recently, a machine was found on the bottom of the Baltic Sea, and as I understand it, the decision was made with respect to this machine that it would not be restored, but would be stabilized, and so that it would not undergo any further deterioration. As we know, a couple of days ago, another machine was found. Actually, 6 machines were found, and I don't know what decision is going to be made about these. But one of the beauties of all of these discoveries is that these machines were not damaged by the Germans. They were not destroyed physically, and therefore the possibility of restoration is much greater. This machine looks as though it could be restored without a great deal of effort through cleaning and perhaps replacing all the wiring and so on. And here's another machine, an M4 probably. You can tell by the lock that you see up here. I don't know what this plate is doing here. It doesn't look as though it came from the machine, but maybe it's from another machine just showing what should be lying there. And this machine looks to be in pretty good condition too. You can see that the contacts, the key tops are pretty good. Notice down here on the left that the steckers are bent over. The top row of steckers are bent over, probably by the people who brought it up. I doubt if it was bent in the process of dropping it in the water, but you can't tell. And you can see there's a lot of corrosion, but the metal seems to be somewhat intact. So this machine, again, could be restored. Here's a machine. We were involved in the recovery of a machine from this lake. We were told that the Germans had thrown things in the lake at the end of the war, and that sounded exciting. So divers went into the lake and using an underwater metal detector, because the visibility in the lake was 1 inch and you couldn't see a thing, the metal objects on the bottom of the lake were brought up. And on the left, you see some radio equipment that was found. On the right, that is, on the left, you see parts of a torpedo that were brought up. And in the back here, you see parts of 2 Enigma machines. The diver who was operating the metal detector got so excited when he felt under the metal detector that he had found an Enigma machine. He could tell by touch what it was, that he momentarily let go of the metal detector and headed for the surface. And we've never found the metal detector since. So sacrifice 1 metal detector in order to bring up 1 relic Enigma, and actually 2. There are really parts of 2 Enigmas that were brought up. This machine is particularly interesting, not only because it was found at the bottom of the lake, but because it was destroyed in a typical way by the Germans. Germans were instructed to destroy their Enigmas, typically by using a hand grenade inside the machine to blow it to smithereens, or whatever was handy. And typically whatever was handy was a hard-toed boot, which was applied liberally to the front of an Enigma, and that bashed in the front of the stecker board that you see here. And then something was done to the light bulb panel. And that bend in the light bulb panel looked somewhat familiar to me. And I thought, I wonder if the butt of a German Mauser rifle could have done that. So we have a friend up here in Vermont that has a collection of German guns, and we borrowed his Mauser rifle, and we fitted the Mauser rifle right into the bend in the light bulb panel of the Enigma, and we were able to determine that, yes, that was what was used to destroy the Enigma. So that we found, or we believe, that the history of this machine is too interesting, where it was found, how it was destroyed, for us to go ahead and restore it. So that decision is we would not restore that machine. General Manteuffel was caught by the Russians and the Americans at the end of the war in a little pocket, and he had a choice of surrendering, and he quickly surrendered to the Americans because he had heard that the Russians would not treat the Germans as well as the Americans. And he buried the Enigma machines his people buried the Enigma that he had in the ground quite deep. They figured no one would ever find it. Little did they know that people would be snooping around in the very exact place where they knew he had surrendered and been kept prisoner. He was kept prisoner in that area for months. So people knew that things were probably going on there, important things may be buried. And so a metal detector was used. Look how deep the Enigma is buried. Here's the grass up at the top here, and you can tell by the shovel here how deep it is. And if you look inside the circle here, you see General Manteuffel's, or one of General Manteuffel's enigmas, seeing the light of day for the first time in about 60 years. And when the Enigma was removed from the ground, gradually, little by little, it became obvious that it was a three-rotor Enigma. So here's an Enigma where we had a tremendous amount of history. It had been brought up out of the ground from a known area. And again, the decision on this Enigma, after we cleaned it up, it looks fairly good. It could be restored, but the decision was there's just much too much history associated with this Enigma. And I personally prefer the looks of an Enigma that's literally shown that it's been through the war to an Enigma that looks almost as though it came out of Heimswith and Reinke's factory. So the decision was not to restore that Enigma. Here's another relic Enigma that has some wonderful historic components to it. You can see the bullet hole in this Enigma. And again, I borrowed from the same friend a Mauser pistol, 7.63 Mauser, and fitted the bullet into that hole. And I could tell that the bullet that was used to partly destroy this Enigma was a Mauser. And therefore we knew that it had probably been destroyed by an officer, because officers carried pistols, whereas the soldiers didn't always carry pistols. And of course, it had the mandatory kicked in checkerboard and keyboard, but the bullet, the path of the bullet through this Enigma was obvious. And when you take the top off the Enigma, you can actually see how the bullet passed through and destroyed the input rotor and one of the rightmost of the rotors. So again, this machine was kept as found, and it now sits in the Spy Museum in New York City. They mounted it beautifully in their display. You can see very clearly the same gunshot damage up there. And I think it makes much more sense to show an Enigma in this way that has history like that than to restore it. On the other hand, sometimes you come across a real basket case Enigma like this. A person in Switzerland decided that he was going to find enough parts to build an Enigma machine. And he spent many, many years collecting parts to put together in the Enigma. And finally, he decided that he was too old and he didn't think he was ever going to succeed. So he sold us all of the parts that he had assembled. And you can see on the left over here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 Hackastanga. And that's a very brittle part of the Enigma that doesn't usually survive very well. And down in the front, you can see all the keys of a keyboard. And then there's another keyboard relic in the back, and all sorts of pieces and parts, and many of them are duplicated. Here's a somewhat closer look at what we're dealing with. We have the keys here in the front. We have the keyboard with more keys in it that are going to have to be cleaned. We have the light bulb panel in pretty good shape, and the switches underneath it, and some of the wiring that came up to the stecker board, and some extra switches here. Now the connections underneath the light bulb panel are not beautiful, as you can see in the lower diagram here, but it is indeed a real basket case. And our decision was that we were going to restore this Enigma. So Dan and I have a major project on our hands for the cold days of winter. And with that, I'm going to turn the podium over to Dan, and he's going to talk about the restoration of an Enigma and the restoration of rotors. And I'm going to stop sharing the screen, and over to you, Dan.
Hi, everybody. Welcome from the top of a mountain in Vermont here. I'm going to go quickly because we're going to end up being well over the time that we plan to keep you all seated here. I'm going to share here. Bear with me.
Looking good.
Okay, can everybody see it?
Yes.
Okay. So we're going to talk about a restoration of A16878, an Enigma I machine. Was manufactured in 1943 in Berlin. A gentleman contacted us in 2017, a young man from Antwerp. He had been tasked with cleaning out a shed near a university there, and was told that he could keep anything that he found. And he stumbled on this in this old shed and contacted us and said, hey, I think I found an Enigma machine. And we asked him to send us some pictures, and we informed him that he had found an Enigma machine. And we asked for a set of pictures, and what he was able to share with us showed an Enigma I machine that was clearly missing a plug board, and everything else looked to be in fair, albeit corroded condition. He was able to tell us that the keys, some would press and some would not, and some that were pressed in would not return, and that when he did press a key, it did not advance the rotors. He was able to open the top to show us the top of the machine, but he could not remove the rotors. So we were left with an incomplete set of information as to making a decision. But based on what we saw, we did decide to negotiate a purchase with this young man and have him send us the machine in the United States, to the United States. The real thing that we couldn't tell here, the real roll of the dice, was what's underneath the panel and under the keyboard. As my father had said, the key contacts and the condition of the contacts and serviceability of those contacts was really at risk here. That was the one variable that we really couldn't pin down. And the machine obviously is also missing its wooden box. So we had him send us the machine in the US, and the first thing we did was to remove the rotors, and we became quite encouraged. The rotors were a matched set to the machine, Bakelite construction, so late war, as the serial number of the machine indicates. And also, the rotors really looked to be in pretty good condition. All the spring-loaded contacts were working, and so we started to have an initial thought about this machine that perhaps it had not been in the ground, or it submerged entirely in water, or at least for not a long period of time, and perhaps this was all atmospheric contact to moisture, or perhaps some rain on the machine, but not a buried machine and not a machine from a lake. So we started to do an initial inspection of the machine, and we found that both wire trunks leading from what had been the stecker board had been intentionally cut. So we think that the stecker board was intentionally removed from this machine, perhaps as a way to disable it at the end of the war. Hard to say. Often it's done in more abrupt ways, as my father mentioned, with rifle butts and blows to the front of the machine. The first step here was to, after we did an initial inspection, was to remove the case from the machine. And I will just state here that when you have a machine that shows a lot of corrosion, you have to go very slowly. It's very easy to booger up screws or to break off fasteners. And you also have to be aware that the bakelite sometimes becomes very brittle and it's very easy to break. So everything's done in a very deliberate and slow way. Don't force anything, use the right tools. The first thing I did once we removed the case from the machine was to apply a little penetrating oil to all the components that were seized up on the exterior of the machine. I knew I wouldn't be working on this metal top for quite some time, so the penetrating oil could have a few months to work, and you only have to put in a little bit and just let it do its magic. We started to inspect the machine now that the case was off, and you see evidence of corrosion on all the exposed steel parts and in all places where you have movement and bearings. So it was no wonder that the fellow had a hard time removing the rotors. He was unable to remove the rotors. Everything had sort of rusted in place. I'm going to take a minute to look at this bracket on the right-hand rear side of the machine here. It's actuated when the release lever for the rotors is moved. We have found, so here's a close-up. First of all, you can see why he had some trouble trying to remove the rotors. This had become bound up and corroded. This shaft on the left here holds the reflector. And this is an actuation plate that's moved by the handle to release the rotors, and this had become seized up. I'm looking at this in detail because this is a cast metal bracket in the right lower corner of the screen here, and it bears some force, especially if somebody tries to force this mechanism. And what we found in the past, and you don't often see this unless you look carefully, this bracket, because it's cast metal, is prone to breaking. And once it breaks, it can disintegrate, or it can cause binding when you try to release your rotors from the machine. Here's another example. This is on an M4, where either time or excessive force started to cause stress fractures in this bracket. And really, if you can, you want to catch this before it completely disintegrates. There are ways to stabilize it. But replacement parts are going to be finding an original replacement is extremely difficult, as this cast metal tends to deteriorate in a lot of the ground found and water found relic machines. Continuing to look around the machine, again, just lots of rust and corrosion, lots of dirt in the bottom of the machine. This photo's a little foggy, but it just showed what we were able to brush out of the machine. These are pine needles. There's broken glass, and broken glass is not uncommon in an Enigma machine. Light bulbs, either through mishandling by the operator or by something striking the machine, the light bulbs can break and the chunks of glass filter down into the machine. And then there's this mix of dirt and sand that we found. So what we did with this material here is put it in a plastic bag and store it in a battery box, and it becomes part of the story of this machine and how it was found in the shed in Antwerp. So the real part that made us happy in this process, this part of the process, was finding that the key contacts, so these are the contacts that reside under the keyboard and are actuated when the keys press these rubber pads and move the contact switches here. We were very pleased to find that even though they showed sign of exposure to moisture, they had not become unserviceable or not able to be restored. We were happy, and the reason is this is what keys look like that have had excessive ground contact or contact with moisture. These keys, I think, were involved. These were from a bunker in Stalingrad. These keys probably are also damaged from wartime effort or destruction efforts, but you see that the corrosion in these stacks of insulators and contacts expands and starts to spread apart the contacts in a way that makes them not easily serviced. Here's another example. Again, you see the corrosion in here forcing the contacts apart and starting to disintegrate the body of the switch. Moving on through the machine, we see now why the fellow had issues with pressing the keys in the shed in Antwerp. The corrosion has built up on the shafts here, and you have some rust on some of the other parts here. So this is going to require an entire disassembly and cleaning. But with the machine sort of having undergone our once-over review, I started to dismantle it into its component pieces, as discussed by my father earlier. The only piece missing here is the stecker board or the plug board. The next step then was to see how are we going to restore this, and I chose the easiest step first, and that was just cleaning up the easily accessible surfaces and components of the machine that were easy to get at. It gave me a good starting point. This process would also allow me to closely inspect the entire machine as I went through this cleaning process to identify the elements of the machine that were going to require much more attention. Again, we think this machine probably was not submerged in water, or at least not for a long period of time. So some of the parts needing cleaning were fairly easy and gave up their dirt and grime relatively easily. Here, we're trying to save the letter film. I'm using warm water and a Q-tip. You sometimes might mix in just a touch of hand soap maybe into your water mix if needed. But what we're trying to do here is save all of the original parts of this machine. We strive when we do these restorations or repairs to save all of the original parts. And if we have to replace a part, we look for original parts to keep the machines whole. Throughout the process, I was using cloth towels, nylon toothbrushes, and then very soft brass wire brushes, super soft. This one's attached to my Dremel tool to make the removal of the rust and cleaning the surfaces a little easier. These are the pawls in the rear of the machine that advance the rotors. So you press a key and the big actuator bar moves, and these get pushed up and against the rotors, each one of these when it's called for. And as my father mentioned earlier, these shaft and bearings along here are very tightly constructed and pressed together, and the springs are wound very tight. And our feeling is that the Germans in the manufacturing process use some sort of lubricant on these that has broken down over the last 75 and 80 years, because these often bind up. And when the key is pressed, these pawls should be forced forward against the rotor, against the ratchets on the rotor all the time. But as this lubricant becomes grabby and binds, these shafts no longer allow the pawls to move easily. So you can press a key and everything sounds like it's working right, but the rotors won't advance. So we're often called to clean these components on what otherwise are Enigma machines, and it can be a little tricky. Sometimes you have to use some heat, either with a soldering iron to help dislodge some of the bound up lubricant. I've also used automotive products like a carburetor cleaner or a brake cleaner to break down the binding old adhesive. And then you want to really clean it all out, dry it out, and apply a very fine and a very light amount of lubricant, almost like you might use a lubricant that a watch repairman might use. We really want to avoid using too much lubricant in the machine. As my father mentioned, the oils can get onto the electrical contacts and cause more problems for you. So then we moved on to the keyboard now, and there's nothing terribly complex about removing the components from the keyboard assembly, except if you have big fingers like me, because these are tight spaces in here. But you start by removing a plate that's mounted in the lower level here of the keyboard assembly. This allows the notched area of the rotor to be extracted out through the hole for the key. And then gently, without breaking any screws, you take off the parts from the key shaft itself and prepare them for cleaning. Again, the corrosion here is not very bad at all. We're really just cleaning this up so that the keys will slide through the key shafts well. One issue we had was a broken key, the M key on the machine. The glass was broken. Fortunately for us, in our inventory, we had a relic keyboard that we had deemed that would not be part of a restoration. So we've used a intact glass cover from this keyboard to match with our M key to get it looking good again. Then we started to put the keys back into the keyboard, which we spent a little time cleaning. And when I say cleaning, our goal is not to have a restored machine come out like it was just produced from the factory. We're not trying to make it look like something it isn't. These are 70 and 80-year-old antiques that have been through the war, quite literally. So we simply want to get them back into working shape and perhaps resembling what they should look like at this point in their life. These are the indexing wheels at the very rear of the machine, and they press onto the rotors, one wheel for each rotor, and help the rotor fall into position when the rotors are moved, either by the operator in setting up the day's key or through a key press. These index wheels help the rotors fall into their correct positioning so that all the contacts will be lined up throughout the rotor stack. And what you have here, and it was on this machine, but we see it on many other machines, this is a clay rubber-like material, and it starts to degrade over time and disintegrate, and actually binds to the shaft that it's mounted on, so these don't rotate freely, and you want them to move very freely for the rotors to move easily. So you disassemble them, and you clean the inside of the wheel and the shaft, and you don't have to always do this, but you may apply just a teeny bit of lubricant. Almost best to put the lubricant on a towel, let it soak into the towel, and just gently rub the towel on the shaft here, and then that usually takes care of the problem. So after a number of months, we went back to the top of the Enigma machine, and the penetrating oil has had a time to get in and do its magic, and with just a little bit of encouragement, these pieces were able to be freed from the machine, and we disassemble them, and you can see the corrosion and dirt that's built up and the reason why they were seized up. So this all gets brushed down and put back together. The hold down screws on the machine, one of them was badly bent, and for this I applied heat with a blowtorch to heat this up, and then had a little metal pipe that was a very thin pipe that I was able to slide over this and gently bend these back into shape. Not all hold down screws are the same on all Enigma machines, so finding a match to another is not always the easiest task, so we were pretty happy to be able to save this piece. And then we were able to put the top all back together, and it started to look a little bit more like an Enigma machine. Again, we made the choice to not use a replica letter film. There are some letters here that were damaged over time, but really our goal is always to keep the machine as original as possible. Then it was on to the rotors, and as we suspected, they were in great shape. They looked in great shape. All we did was check the continuity of all the contacts and that they were wired correctly as they should be for an Enigma I German military machine. We used David Hamer's wiring schematic here to help us verify all the contacts. And when I'm in an Enigma machine doing repairs or restoration work, if you stand 5 feet back from an Enigma machine, they all look about the same, and there's usually no documentation or clear evidence of where a machine was used or how it was used or who used it. But in this case, even though this machine was made fairly late in the war in 1943, it's got some pretty deep grooves worn into the backside of the rotor here, indicating that it saw quite a bit of service. I don't know for sure that it was used in Antwerp, but that's what was found, and this machine clearly saw a good deal of use in the year and a half or 2 years that it saw service. So with the machine, the easy part of the machine cleaned up and put back together, we moved on to the harder part. And the hardest part was thinking about what to do about that missing stecker board on the front of the machine. Fortunately, we had a relic machine in inventory that we had deemed not eligible for restoration. It had a somewhat intact plug board, and we decided that we would try to use this piece for our machine. And there was a gentle process of removing it from the existing machine. Great deal of corrosion, some concern that we were going to break it, so we went very slowly with this process, and we flipped it over and saw that, well, there is quite a bit of corrosion on the back of this plug board. It looks more like a coral reef in the ocean than it does a piece of military communications equipment. But nonetheless, most of the parts appear to be there and intact. The only thing that's missing, there should be springs off each side of the shorting bar should have a spring running down to hold it in place. And all of the springs had rotted away, but everything else appeared to perhaps be there. So we started to remove I started to remove the components from the board, and here I was using almost what you think of as a dental tool, a pick that you might have your teeth cleaned with, a metal stainless steel pick, where I knocked off and pried away bits of corrosion so that I could then put wrenches and sockets onto the nuts and ease the components off of the board. This was a fairly tedious process. You really didn't want to rush anything and break anything, as these were all original parts and appeared to be serviceable. When we had the parts off, we started the cleaning process, and to our great pleasure, these pieces did clean up well and did not show signs of damage from exposure to moisture and whatever else had been in the shed. This is not the keyboard itself, but this is what I did. The face of the plug board had become warped over time as the elements had worked their magic on it. And I was able to flatten out the keyboard somewhat by applying a great deal of heat and pressure to the board using a clothes iron. And with the pieces cleaned up, I started to reassemble the plug board slowly. Again, I have big fingers, and this is really finite work, so fine work. So it involved lots of needle nose pliers and magnifying glasses. And we slowly worked our way back up the stecker board. And finally got it back to looking somewhat like an Enigma machine, albeit with our own twist of colored wires. And before I could go much further, I had to fix or at least determine on the input rotor which wire was which. So I used stickers here to label each of the wires and a meter to determine which wire was which. The same had to be done on the light bulb panel. Each wire had to be identified and labeled. And we start to tie the circuits back together. We wrap the wire in cloth, which is the way it is done on an Enigma machine. And our finished product about to be mounted to the machine. Here are the parts cleaned up and ready to go back together. It was much more fun putting them back together clean than it was taking them apart covered in dirt and corrosion. Pieces coming back together. Some parts cleaned up very well. And everything's fitting back in. One of the challenges was making sure that the wire trunks were the right length to make sure they would fit back in the machine without binding up any of the moving actions of the machine. And sliding the keyboard back on. And with the machine back together, the big test was, of course, hooking up the battery here on the right to the external contacts and having a light bulb light. So this confirmed that we had tackled the electronics of the machine in a successful way. A couple of shots of the finished machine, and it's looking pretty good. We're pretty happy with it. However, we're still missing a box. So fortunately, a year or so before the gentleman contacted us with this machine, we had acquired a box from a woman in West Virginia. Her grandfather had served in the 101st Airborne in Europe during World War II, involved in the Battle of the Bulge and the liberation of Berchtesgaden in Germany. He sent back a number of letters and documents regarding his time in Europe. And he had found this Enigma box, and he had filled it with loot that he had acquired during the war, trinkets from the war, and put his name onto the top of it and sealed it up and sent it to himself in West Virginia. So this box arrived at his house full of goodies from the war, and the box stayed in the family until 2016 when we were able to purchase it. And that's the end of my discussion about this machine. It now has a box with a story. It is restored and working with a bit of a story behind it. And we're pretty happy that we made the choice to pursue this project. I'm going to spend just 1 or 2 minutes more on a related work, although not on this machine. I did some restoration work a few years ago on some rotors that we had some problems with. And you'll see here, this is a really tight and confined space you're dealing with when you're working on these rotors. And everything has to be done in a pretty deliberate way and with the right materials to get things to go back together if you're going to try to take apart an Enigma rotor. This is the process of disassembly, and here are the parts of the rotor I chose to work on. Taking apart the rotor is something difficult about it, except that, as I mentioned earlier, the Bakelite components here can become very brittle with age. So it is very easy to crack them. Just the simple action of removing or replacing a screw can crack the Bakelite. So you really want to move in a very slow and deliberate way when working on the rotors. We were able to clean the rotor once it was disassembled and the brass contacts, and then address this mess. This rotor, when we took it apart, had 3 wires that were different from the others. We think somebody may have tried to repair this rotor in the past, but it maybe have not stuck, have not worked, because not enough of the contacts were working on this rotor to have it be useful in a machine. So we start by unsoldering all these wires, and you have to be very careful. You apply the heat of the soldering iron to the solder point here at the top of the contact, and that contact becomes very hot and can expand, and in expanding can crack the Bakelite plate here. So what I did to mitigate that was take a wet paper towel, put it under the plate, and then press down on the plate so that when I soldered, the heat would dissipate out to a moist towel a little bit and minimize the chance of cracking the base. Once I had my wires attached, I made a little jig and a template here so I could identify where the wires had to go and get them all pieced together as best I could. There's a shot of the other side here, the wires coming through. And then the next step up, once you had the wires all in the right slots and everything soldered on the back plate correctly, you want to start to identify the length of the wires. And this is the tricky part, because if you leave the wires too long, you're not going to be able to get the rotor back together. If they're too short, you can't solder on the spring-loaded contacts. Here the spring-loaded contacts being soldered back on, and here's some other rotors that I've worked on that had to have repairs. Same idea, where you replace a wire and you really have to have the length correct at the end of the day. And another. And well, with any luck, everything goes back together as planned. And that is the end. I know I went quickly trying to make us go not too long here, but now we can take questions if people would like.